Sometimes the most broken souls find each other in the darkest moments. Sometimes a stranger's pain becomes the bridge back to our own humanity. Job Blackwood has lived alone in the Colorado mountains for 15 years, with only his dog Scout for company. He chose this life after losing everything that mattered to him. On a bitter December night, when the snow falls heavy and the wind cuts like a knife, he hears something that doesn't belong in the wilderness. A child's cry. Outside his cabin, buried in the snow, he finds a little girl, barely alive from the cold. She won't speak and she won't tell him where she came from. But as Job nurses her back to health, he starts to realize this child might be connected to the very tragedy that drove him to these mountains. Could this mysterious child be the key to redemption he never thought he deserved? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence in Job Blackwood's cabin had a weight to it, thick as the pine smoke that curled from his stone chimney into the December sky. 15 years of solitude had given that silence a voice of its own, whispering of things better left forgotten. The worn leather Bible on his mantelpiece hadn't been opened in all those years. Its gold-lettered spine faded to the color of old brass. Once upon a time, that book had been his constant companion, its pages dog-eared from countless sermons delivered to congregations across 3 territories. Now it gathered dust beside a daguerreotype of a woman with gentle eyes and a child with pigtails, their faces frozen in time like flowers pressed between pages. Job pushed himself up from his hand-hewn chair, his joints protesting the cold that seeped through every crack in the cabin walls. At 58, his body carried the accumulated aches of a hard life, the shoulder that never quite healed right after a horse threw him in 67, the scar along his jaw from a saloon fight in his younger, more foolish days, and the deeper wounds that no doctor could tend. His hands, calloused from decades of splitting wood and mending things, reached for the coffee pot that sat perpetually warm on the wood stove. Scout lifted his grizzled muzzle from where he lay, sprawled before the fire, one amber eye opening to assess whether his master's movement required attention. The old hound had been with Job for 8 years now, found as a half-starved pup wandering the trading post in Granite Falls. Some unspoken understanding had passed between man and dog that day, a recognition that they were both creatures who'd known abandonment. Scout's presence had made the mountain silences bearable, his steady breathing and occasional dream whimpers serving as proof that Job wasn't completely alone in the world. The cabin itself stood as testament to Job's determination to carve out a life far from the complications of civilization. Built into a natural clearing surrounded by towering pines and aspens, it commanded a view of the valley that stretched for miles in every direction. No road led to this place, only a narrow trail that Job had blazed himself, winding through deadfall and over creek beds that could swallow a horse and rider if a man didn't know their secrets. The isolation was deliberate, purchased with sweat and stubbornness, paid for in the currency of regret. Inside, the cabin reflected the methodical nature of a man who'd learned to depend only on himself. Shelves lined the walls, holding mason jars filled with preserved vegetables, dried herbs, and the fruits of summer's brief abundance. His rifle hung above the door, cleaned and oiled weekly out of habit rather than necessity. The mountain provided most of what threatened him these days. Harsh weather, the occasional bear, the treacherous footing of ice-slicked trails. Men had ceased to be a concern when he'd chosen this exile. The kitchen area, little more than a sturdy table and the wood stove, bore the scars of countless meals prepared for one. Job's cooking had improved over the years through necessity rather than passion. Venison stew, cornbread, coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, simple food that filled the belly and asked nothing more. He'd given up trying to recreate the elaborate Sunday dinners that had once graced his table. When grace was said with genuine gratitude and laughter seasoned every dish, a knock at the door would have shocked him speechless. But no visitor had made the treacherous journey to his retreat in all the years he'd lived here. The nearest neighbor lived 20 miles down the mountain, and they'd reached an understanding that distance was meant to be respected. Occasionally, Job would ride to Granite Falls for supplies, enduring the curious stares and whispered conversations that followed him through the general store. The townsfolk knew him as the hermit who paid in gold coin and spoke only when spoken to, a man whose past was his own business and whose present asked nothing of anyone. But solitude had its own seasons, and Job had learned to read them like an old farmer reads the sky. There were the productive months when his hands stayed busy with repairs and improvements, when the satisfaction of honest work filled the empty spaces. There were the contemplative times when he'd sit on his porch and watch the elk move through the valley below, their unhurried passage a reminder that time moved differently in the mountains. And then there were the dark months, usually deep winter, when the weight of memory pressed down like snow on a cabin roof, threatening to collapse everything he'd built to keep the past at bay. This December felt different, though he couldn't name why. Scout had been restless for days, pacing the cabin and whining at sounds only he could hear. The dog's anxiety was contagious, leaving Job checking his perimeter more often than usual, studying the tree line for movement that didn't belong. Perhaps it was nothing more than the promise of a hard winter. The air had that brittle quality that spoke of storms to come, and the animals had been preparing with unusual urgency. Job settled back into his chair with his coffee, the ceramic mug warming his hands as he studied the flames dancing in the fireplace. He'd built this life, one careful stone at a time, creating a fortress of routine and solitude that had kept him sane when sanity seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford. The preacher he'd once been felt like a character from someone else's story now. That man who'd stood before congregations and spoke of God's plan with the confidence of the truly faithful. The accident had changed everything. One moment of inattention, a wagon wheel catching in a rut, and his world had shattered like glass hitting stone. His wife Martha and daughter Rachel, taken in an instant while he walked away with nothing worse than guilt that would outlive his body. The town had rallied around him with casseroles and sympathy, but their kindness had felt like salt in wounds that refused to heal. He'd preached 3 more sermons after the funeral, his voice growing smaller each Sunday until even he couldn't hear the conviction in his own words. The sheriff's badge he'd worn before taking up the cloth had offered a different kind of purpose for a while. Law enforcement suited a man who no longer saw the world in shades of grace and forgiveness. But even that life had grown hollow, each arrest and investigation a reminder that justice was too often a luxury the innocent couldn't afford. When he'd finally hung up the badge for good, no one had been surprised. Joe Blackwood had become a man who collected disappointments like some men collected coins. Scout's head jerked up suddenly, his ears pricked forward in alert attention. The dog rose to his feet with the fluid grace of a predator, every muscle tense as he faced the cabin door. A low growl rumbled in his throat, not the warning he'd give for a bear or cougar, but something else, something that commanded different caution. Job set down his coffee and reached for the rifle, his movements automatic and sure. 15 years of isolation had taught him to trust Scout's instincts above his own when it came to sensing danger. The dog had saved his life more than once, alerting him to everything from rock slides to the occasional 2-legged threat that wandered too far into the mountains looking for easy pickings. The wind outside had picked up, driving snow against the windows with the persistence of something alive. But beneath that familiar sound, Job caught something else, a thin wailing that rose and fell like a lost soul, crying for redemption. Scout's growl faded to a worried whine as the sound came again, clearer this time and unmistakably human, a child's cry, carried on the winter wind like a prayer sent to the wrong address. Job's hand tightened on the rifle as every instinct warred within him. The smart thing would be to bar the door and wait for morning. Let whatever tragedy played out in his yard resolve itself without his involvement. He'd learned the hard way that playing the hero rarely ended well for anyone involved. But Scout was already at the door, his tail wagging with cautious hope. And somewhere in that sound was an echo of every night Job had wondered if God still answered prayers, even from men who'd stopped asking. The cry came a third time, weaker now, fading like hope in a hard winter. Job made his choice the way a man chooses to breathe, without conscious thought, driven by something deeper than logic. He pulled on his heavy coat and boots, checked the load in his rifle, and opened the door to whatever waited in the darkness beyond. The cold hit Job like a physical blow as he stepped into the night, the wind driving snow into his face with needle-sharp intensity. Scout bounded past him, nose to the ground as he followed some invisible trail only he could read. The dog's excitement was palpable, his movements quick and purposeful as he led Job away from the cabin's warmth into the howling darkness. 20 yards from his front door, Scout stopped and began digging frantically at what looked like nothing more than a depression in the snow. But as Job approached with his lantern held high, the wind shifted, and he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. A small hand, pale as carved bone, protruding from the white drift like a grave marker. "Sweet, merciful God," he whispered, dropping to his knees beside Scout and beginning to dig with his bare hands. The snow was deeper than he'd realized, packed hard by the wind, but giving way under his desperate efforts. What emerged from that frozen tomb would haunt his dreams for years to come. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, this child who'd somehow found her way to his doorstep. Her dark hair was matted with ice and snow, her lips blue with cold that ran deeper than winter. She wore a thin dress that might have been yellow once, now torn and stained with things Job didn't want to identify. Over it all, she clutched a threadbare blanket that provided about as much protection as a spider's web. But she was breathing, shallow, rattling breaths that clouded in the frigid air like visible prayers. Job gathered her into his arms, shocked by how little she weighed, how fragile she felt against his chest. Scout whined and pressed close, his warm breath creating a small pocket of reprieve from the wind. "I've got you now," Job murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. "You're going to be all right." The journey back to the cabin felt like miles instead of yards, each step a battle against wind that seemed determined to steal what little life remained in the small form he carried. Once inside, Job laid her on his own bed, closest to the fireplace, and began the delicate work of warming someone back from the edge of forever. He'd done this before. Years ago, when his sheriff's badge had required him to pull half-frozen travelers from snowdrifts and spring floods. The key was patience. Too much heat too fast could kill as surely as the cold. He removed her wet clothing with clinical efficiency, his eyes carefully averted from anything that might compromise her dignity. What he saw instead made his jaw clench with barely controlled rage. Bruises, old ones faded to yellow and green, and newer ones that spoke of recent violence. Someone had hurt this child, and recently. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone who'd worked law enforcement. The grip marks on her upper arms, the defensive wounds on her hands, the way she flinched even in unconsciousness when he touched certain areas. Job wrapped her in his warmest blankets and began the slow process of bringing circulation back to her extremities. Scout had appointed himself guardian, lying beside the bed, with his chin resting on the mattress, brown eyes never leaving the girl's face. The dog's presence seemed to calm her somehow, her breathing becoming less labored as the warmth gradually returned to her small body. It was while searching her torn dress for any clues to her identity that Job found it. A photograph, or rather half of one, torn raggedly down the middle. What remained showed a woman's face, kind eyes and a gentle smile that spoke of love and laughter. The other half was missing, leaving Job to wonder who else had been captured in that moment of happiness. He studied the fragment by lamplight, noting the quality of the paper and the style of dress. This wasn't some tintype taken at a traveling photographer's wagon. This was a proper portrait, the kind wealthy families commissioned for posterity. Yet here was this woman's daughter, dressed in rags and bearing the marks of abuse, found half dead in a snowdrift, miles from any civilization. The girl stirred as dawn approached, her eyelids fluttering like butterfly wings, before opening to reveal eyes the color of storm clouds. For a moment she stared at the cabin ceiling with the blank confusion of someone emerging from deep sleep. Then her gaze found Job, sitting in his chair beside the bed, and terror flooded her features. She tried to scramble backward, weak limbs tangling in the blankets as she sought escape from this stranger who'd taken her from the snow. A small, wordless cry escaped her lips, the first sound she'd made since Job found her. It was a sound that belonged to no child, a noise scraped raw by experiences no young soul should endure. "Easy now," Job said softly, making no move toward her. "You're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you." But his words seemed to have the opposite effect. The girl's breathing quickened, her eyes darting around the cabin like a trapped animal, seeking a way out. She clutched the torn photograph to her chest, the only thing she'd brought with her from whatever hell she'd escaped. Scout solved the problem in the way only a dog could, rising from his position beside the bed and gently placing his massive head on the blanket near her hand. The gesture was so obviously peaceful, so unthreatening, that some of the panic faded from her eyes. Her free hand moved tentatively toward the dog's grizzled fur, and when Scout's tail gave the slightest wag, she allowed herself to stroke his head. "That's Scout," Job said quietly. "He's the one who found you. Best tracker in 3 counties, though he's getting on in years like the rest of us." The girl said nothing, but her grip on the photograph loosened slightly. Job could see intelligence in those storm-grey eyes, a sharpness that suggested she understood every word, even if she chose not to respond. Her silence wasn't the blank emptiness of simple-mindedness. It was deliberate, purposeful, the choice of someone who'd learned that words could be dangerous. Over the next hours, Job established a careful routine. He brought her broth, thin at first, and then gradually thicker as her stomach proved capable of handling solid food. He never approached too quickly or made sudden movements, treating her with the same patience he'd use for a wounded wild creature. Scout remained her constant companion, seeming to understand his role as intermediary between the frightened child and the gruff mountain man who'd become her reluctant savior. She ate mechanically, her eyes never leaving Job's face, as if expecting him to transform into some new threat. When he offered her fresh clothing, an old shirt of his that hung like a dress on her small frame, she accepted it but turned away to change. Modesty intact despite everything she'd endured, the storm that had brought her to his door showed no signs of abating. If anything, the wind had grown stronger, piling snow against the cabin walls and making any thoughts of travel impossible. They were trapped together, this broken child and the man who'd fled from broken things, forced into an intimacy neither had chosen. As night fell again, Job made up a bed for himself on the floor near the fireplace, giving her the privacy of his own room. He lay listening to her restless movements, the small sounds of someone fighting nightmares, even in waking. Scout had remained with her, and Job could hear the dog's steady breathing, punctuated by occasional whimpers from the girl. Tomorrow would bring decisions he wasn't ready to make. Should he try to take her to town when the storm passed? Should he contact the territorial authorities? Every instinct told him that whoever had hurt her was still out there, still looking. The bruises on her arms weren't the kind that healed quickly, and the terror in her eyes suggested her flight was recent. But tonight, with the wind howling like lost souls outside his door, Blackwood found himself responsible for something he'd thought was lost to him forever, another life that depended on his choices. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd failed to protect his own family was now guardian to a child who'd somehow found her way through a blizzard to his door. Perhaps God still had a sense of humor after all. Or perhaps he was offering Job Blackwood one last chance at redemption, wrapped in threadbare blankets and carried on the winter wind. 3 days passed in a careful dance of avoidance and tentative trust. The girl Job had taken to calling her little one in his mind, since she offered no name, seemed to grow stronger with each meal, though her silence remained as unbroken as fresh snow. She watched everything he did with those storm-grey eyes, cataloguing his movements and habits with the intensity of someone whose survival had once depended on reading the moods of dangerous men. Job found himself talking to her anyway, filling the cabin's silence with observations about the weather, explanations of his daily routines, and stories about Scout's various adventures over the years. She never responded verbally, but he caught her listening, saw the way her head turned slightly when he spoke, noted how she relaxed when his voice carried no threat. It was on the fourth morning that he noticed her staring at something on his mantelpiece with particular intensity. Following her gaze, he saw she'd fixed on a small wooden cross he'd carved years ago during a particularly difficult winter. It was simple work, nothing fancy, but he'd whittled it for Rachel during one of her childhood illnesses, something to hold when the fever dreams got too frightening. Without thinking too much about the decision, Job reached up and took the cross down, turning it over in his weathered hands. The wood had darkened with age, the grain wearing smooth from handling. He'd kept it all these years, though he couldn't say why, perhaps as proof that he'd once been a man who created things instead of running from them. "This was my daughter's," he said quietly, settling into the chair beside her bed. "Made it for her when she was about your age, maybe a year or two older. She liked to hold it when storms got too loud or when she couldn't sleep." The girl's eyes moved from the cross to his face, searching for something he couldn't name. Slowly, carefully, Job extended his hand, offering the small carved piece. "Thought you might like to have it," he continued. "Seems like it should belong to someone who might need it." Her small hand emerged from beneath the blankets, trembling slightly as she reached for the cross. When her fingers closed around it, something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening that spoke of gratitude beyond words. She pulled the cross to her chest, holding it the way Rachel once had. And for a moment, Job felt the ghost of his daughter's presence so strongly it took his breath away. Scout, ever sensitive to the emotional currents in the room, chose that moment to rest his chin on the edge of the bed, offering his own form of comfort. The girl's free hand found his fur, and for the first time since Job had found her, he saw something approaching peace in her features. Over the following days, he began teaching her small tasks around the cabin. Simple things that required no words, but gave her hands purpose. She proved remarkably quick to learn, following his demonstrations with careful attention before attempting each task herself. Whether it was feeding the fire, organizing supplies, or helping prepare meals, she approached everything with the methodical seriousness of someone much older than her years. Job found himself remembering what it was like to have a child in his home, the way their presence changed the very air of a place. Little things he'd forgotten began surfacing in his memory, how Rachel used to hum while she worked, the way she'd arrange her dolls just so on her bed each morning, the questions she'd ask about everything from why snow was white to where the stars went during the day. This girl was different, marked by experiences that had stolen her voice and shadowed her eyes. But there were moments when Job caught glimpses of who she might have been in a gentler world. The careful way she arranged the wooden cross on the small table beside her bed each morning, how she saved the choicest bits of her meals for Scout, bribing the old dog's loyalty with scraps of bacon and pieces of biscuit, the intense concentration she brought to every task, as if proving her worth through usefulness. It was during one of these quiet moments, as she helped him sort through his meager medical supplies, that the memories came flooding back with unprecedented clarity. Job found himself transported to another time, another life. When his hands had been gentler and his heart less guarded, he remembered teaching Rachel to identify different herbs, her small fingers careful not to crush the delicate leaves as she helped him prepare remedies for the congregation. Martha had been the real healer in the family, her knowledge of plants and their properties passed down from her grandmother. But Rachel had shown an aptitude that promised to surpass them both. "Willow bark for pain," he heard himself saying aloud, holding up a piece of the dried bark. "Mama always said it worked better than anything the doctor brought in his black bag." The girl looked up at him, her attention complete and focused. For a moment, Job felt the urge to stop, to retreat back into the safe silence that had protected him for so long. But something in her expression encouraged him to continue. She made tea from it when folks had the fever, or when old bones ached come winter. Said the trees knew secrets we'd forgotten. That everything we needed to heal was growing right under our feet if we just knew how to look. As if responding to some invisible cue, the girl pointed to another bundle of dried leaves, her eyebrows raised in question. Job felt a strange tightness in his chest. When was the last time someone had shown genuine interest in what he had to say? "That's sage," he explained, his voice growing stronger. "Good for clearing the lungs when winter settles in too deep. And this here," he held up a small vial of dark liquid, "is elderberry syrup. Martha swore it could fight off just about any sickness if you caught it early enough." The afternoon passed in this manner, Job sharing knowledge he'd thought buried with his past, while the girl listened with the intensity of a scholar. She began pointing to different items, silently requesting their names and purposes. And Job found himself falling into the rhythm of teaching, remembering how much he'd once enjoyed sharing knowledge with eager young minds. When evening came, and they sat before the fire with Scout stretched between them, Job realized something had changed. The cabin no longer felt like a fortress against the world. It felt like a home, where two people shared space and purpose, where silence could be comfortable instead of defensive. The girl still clutched the wooden cross as she settled down to sleep, and Job caught himself offering a prayer for the first time in 15 years, not for forgiveness or understanding, but simply for the strength to protect this small life that had stumbled into his care. Outside, the wind continued its eternal conversation with the mountain peaks, but inside, something warmer than firelight had begun to grow. By the end of the first week, the girl had claimed a corner of the cabin as her own workspace. Using charcoal from the fireplace and pieces of bark Job had gathered for kindling, she began creating images that spoke louder than any words she might have offered. At first, Job thought they were simple childhood drawings, stick figures, and basic shapes that any child might create to pass the time. Then he looked closer. The drawings told a story of horror that made his blood run cold. Dark figures with harsh, angular features, pursuing smaller forms across the rough bark canvas. Buildings that looked like they were on fire, with tiny people fleeing in all directions. And again, the image of a small figure hiding, while larger shapes searched with obvious menace. One drawing in particular caught his attention, a detailed scene that showed a small person crouched behind what looked like a fallen log, while three dark figures stood nearby, their postures aggressive and searching. The little person in the drawing clutched something to their chest, and with a start, Job realized it was meant to be the torn photograph she still carried everywhere. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, studying the crude but effective artwork. "What did you see, little one?" She looked up from her work, following his gaze to the drawings scattered around her corner. For a moment her eyes met his, and he saw such depth of pain there that he had to look away. This wasn't the normal fear of a lost child. This was the terror of someone who'd witnessed unspeakable things and lived to carry the memory. Job began paying closer attention to the sounds that came from outside the cabin. Every creak of settling wood, every snap of a branch under snow's weight, every call of a winter bird seemed to send the girl into a state of alert tension. She would freeze whatever she was doing and listen with the intensity of prey that knows predators are near. Scout felt it too. The old dog had become increasingly restless, spending long minutes at the door or windows, his hackles raised at threats only he could sense. More than once, Job caught him staring toward the tree line with the focused attention of a hunting animal, his entire body rigid with suspicion. The implications were becoming clear, and Job didn't like what they suggested. This child hadn't simply gotten lost in the woods. She was running from something or someone. The bruises on her arms weren't from a fall or accident, and her terror wasn't the result of being separated from loving parents. Someone had hurt her, and worse, someone might still be looking for her. Job found himself checking his perimeter more carefully during his daily routines, looking for signs that unwanted visitors had found his hidden sanctuary. The snow helped. Any tracks would be obvious against the white expanse, but it also worked against him, potentially leading pursuers right to his door if they were skilled enough trackers during their evening meals. He began testing her knowledge of the outside world through careful conversation, watching her reactions to place names and trying to gauge how far she might have traveled to reach his cabin. "Ever been to Granite Falls?" he asked casually while serving her a bowl of venison stew. "Little town about 20 miles down the mountain. Has a general store, church, saloon, the usual things." Her reaction was immediate and telling. She shook her head quickly, but her eyes showed recognition. She'd heard of the place, even if she'd never been there herself. "What about Colorado Springs?" "That's the big city, comparatively speaking. Takes the better part of a week to ride there from here, assuming the weather cooperates." Again, the shake of the head, but this time with less recognition. Whatever had happened to her, it had been closer to home than Colorado Springs. Job tried a different approach. "The folks who hurt you, they coming after you?" The effect was immediate and devastating. The girl dropped her spoon, her whole body beginning to shake as tears filled her eyes. She wrapped her arms around herself protectively, rocking slightly in her chair while Scout whined and pressed against her legs. "I'm sorry," Job said quickly, reaching out instinctively before stopping himself. "I didn't mean to frighten you. Nobody's going to hurt you here, little one, I promise you that, but the damage was done." She spent the rest of the evening in a state of barely controlled panic, jumping at every sound and refusing to let Scout leave her side. When she finally settled down to sleep, she positioned herself so she could see both the door and the windows, the wooden cross clutched tight in one hand and the torn photograph in the other. Job lay awake long into the night, his mind churning with possibilities he didn't want to consider. Whoever had hurt this child was probably still out there, and if they were determined enough to pursue her into the wilderness, they wouldn't stop searching just because of a little snow. Men who abused children weren't known for their reasonableness or their respect for weather conditions. He found himself remembering his years wearing a badge, the cases that had kept him awake at night, even when the paperwork was filed and the criminals were behind bars. There had been too many situations like this. Children caught in the crossfire of adult evil, innocents who paid the price for other people's sins. He'd learned to harden his heart against such things, to focus on the law rather than the emotional cost of enforcing it. But this was different. This child wasn't a case file or a witness statement. She was a living, breathing reminder of every injustice he'd failed to prevent, every innocent he'd been too late to save. The badge was long gone, but the instincts remained, and every one of them was screaming that danger was coming. The next morning brought fresh snow and no sign of visitors, but Job's unease continued to grow. He began making subtle preparations, checking his ammunition, ensuring his rifle was easily accessible, reviewing the defensive advantages his cabin's position offered. If trouble came calling, he intended to be ready for it. Meanwhile, the girl continued her artwork with disturbing dedication. Each new drawing revealed more details of whatever trauma had driven her to his door, and each one reinforced Job's growing certainty that she was running from more than just bad memories. The dark figures in her pictures weren't abstract representations of fear. They were specific, detailed, recognizable as individuals if someone knew what to look for. Someone was definitely looking for her. The only question was how long it would take them to find this remote sanctuary, and whether Job would be ready when they did. As he watched her carefully arrange her drawings each evening, organizing them like evidence or testimony, Job realized she was trying to tell him something important. These weren't just the artistic expression of a traumatized child. They were a warning, a desperate attempt to communicate the danger they both faced. He just hoped he was wise enough to understand the message before it was too late. The discovery came by accident, as the most significant revelations often do. Job was searching through an old trunk for additional blankets when his fingers closed around something he'd forgotten he still possessed. a tarnished sheriff's badge wrapped in oiled cloth. Hidden beneath layers of winter clothes and memories he'd tried to bury, he lifted the badge to the lamplight, studying the worn metal that had once represented his commitment to law and order. Five-pointed star, Colorado Territory Sheriff, etched in letters that time had softened but not erased. For nearly a decade he'd worn this badge with pride, believing that justice was something a good man could deliver with patience and determination. The girl noticed his stillness and looked up from her latest drawing, her storm-grey eyes taking in the badge with an expression that made Job's blood freeze. Recognition flashed across her features, followed immediately by terror so profound she actually pressed herself back against the cabin wall, as if the small piece of metal posed physical threat. "Easy, little one," Job said softly, setting the badge on the table between them. This is old history. I haven't worn this in 15 years, but his words seemed to have little effect. The girl's breathing had quickened, and she was shaking her head with desperate urgency, pointing at the badge and then at herself with gestures that clearly meant danger. Whatever had happened to her, law enforcement had been involved, and not in a way that offered protection. Job studied her reaction with the analytical mind that had once made him an effective lawman. The specific nature of her fear suggested she'd had direct negative contact with someone wearing a badge. Either she'd been failed by the authorities, who should have protected her, or worse, she'd been actively pursued by corrupt officials who were part of whatever evil she'd escaped. "Did someone wearing one of these hurt you?" he asked gently. The girl's nod was small but definite, and Job felt something cold settle in his stomach. If she was running from corrupt lawmen, then taking her to the territorial authorities would be delivering her directly back to her tormentors. The implications were staggering. How could he protect her if he couldn't trust the very system designed to ensure justice? Over the next few days, Job found himself viewing the girl's drawings with new understanding. The dark figures she depicted weren't random criminals. They were organized, methodical, working together with the efficiency of people who believed they were above the law. Some of the figures wore what could be interpreted as badges or symbols of authority, explaining her terror at seeing his old sheriff's star. The pattern that emerged from her artwork painted a picture of systematic corruption that made Job's jaw clench with familiar anger. He'd encountered such situations during his own time wearing a badge, networks of officials who used their positions to enrich themselves at the expense of the innocent, men who perverted justice into a tool for personal gain. Scout's behavior had grown increasingly agitated as well, as if the dogs sensed the gravity of what they faced. He'd taken to positioning himself between the girl and the cabin's entrance, his instincts apparently recognizing threats that were still beyond human perception. More than once, Job had seen the old hound's ears prick up at sounds too distant for human hearing, his body tensing with predatory alertness. Job began teaching the girl practical survival skills with new urgency, framing the lessons as games to avoid adding to her fear. How to move silently through the forest, which plants were safe to eat if they had to live off the land, how to read weather signs and find shelter in the wilderness. She proved remarkably apt at learning, her young mind absorbing information with the intensity of someone who understood that knowledge meant survival. "If we ever had to leave here quickly," he explained, while showing her how to identify edible roots, "you'd need to know how to take care of yourself in the woods. Not because I'm planning to abandon you, but because sometimes life doesn't give us choices about when or how we have to move." She listened with the grave attention of a student whose final exam might determine her survival. When he showed her how to start a fire using flint and steel, she practiced until her small fingers could produce sparks consistently. When he taught her to read animal tracks in the snow, she memorized the differences between deer and elk, between the padded paws of mountain cats and the clawed prints of bears. The badge remained on the table where he'd left it, neither of them willing to acknowledge its presence directly, but both acutely aware of what it represented. Job found himself remembering cases from his law enforcement days, particularly the ones that had ended badly. Witnesses who disappeared before they could testify. Evidence that had mysteriously vanished from locked storage rooms. Criminals who'd walked free because key officials had been compromised during one of their evening meals. As the girl worked on a new drawing that showed remarkable detail for someone so young, Job made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. "I want you to know something, little one," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a solemn promise. "Whatever you're running from, whoever hurt you, they're going to have to go through me to get to you. I know I'm just one old man who's been hiding in these mountains for 15 years, but I swear on my daughter's memory that no harm will come to you while I'm breathing." The girl looked up from her drawing, and for the first time since he'd found her, Job saw something other than fear in those storm-grey eyes. Hope tentative and fragile as new snow, but real nonetheless. She reached across the table and gently touched the wooden cross he'd given her, then pointed to him with a gesture that somehow conveyed gratitude beyond words. It was in that moment that Job realized his exile was over. For 15 years, he'd hidden from the world and its complexities, convinced that he'd forfeited the right to protect anyone after failing his own family. But this broken child had found her way to his door, carrying secrets that could destroy her and truths that powerful men would kill to keep hidden. The moral clarity was startling in its simplicity. Good men protected the innocent regardless of the cost to themselves. It was a principle he'd forgotten in his grief, buried beneath layers of guilt and self-recrimination. But watching this brave little girl struggle to communicate dangers she couldn't voice, seeing the way she clutched that wooden cross like a talisman against the darkness of her memories, Job felt something long dormant stirring within him. He was still a protector, badge or no badge. The mountains had taught him patience and self-reliance, but they'd also preserved something essential, the part of him that couldn't walk away from injustice, that wouldn't abandon someone who needed help simply because helping might prove dangerous. Scout seemed to sense the change in his master's demeanor, the dog's tail wagging approval, as if he'd been waiting years for Job to remember who he really was. The old hound had always been an excellent judge of character, and his immediate bonding with the girl suggested she was worthy of protection, regardless of what secrets she carried. As the fire burned low and the girl prepared for sleep, arranging her drawings in careful order and placing the wooden cross within easy reach, Job made plans that would have terrified him just hours earlier. Tomorrow he would begin preparing for the possibility that they might have to run. He'd scout escape routes through the mountains, identify safe places where they could hide if pursuit came too close, gather supplies that could sustain them during a difficult journey. The badge gleamed dully in the firelight, a reminder of oaths taken and promises broken, but also of the man he'd once been, someone who stood between the innocent and those who would harm them. Perhaps it was time to remember that justice didn't require official authorization, that protecting the helpless was a calling that transcended titles and institutions. Outside, the wind whispered secrets through the pine boughs, and somewhere in that ancient conversation between earth and sky, Job Blackwood found the courage to be a guardian once again. The music box had been Martha's, a delicate thing of brass and painted wood that played a lullaby she'd hummed to Rachel every night for years. Job had packed it away after the accident, unable to bear the sound of that gentle melody when everything beautiful in his world had been reduced to ash and regret. He'd forgotten it was even there, hidden in the deepest corner of the trunk beneath. Clothes that still carried the faint scent of lavender and love, but the girl's latest drawing had shown something that made him search through those painful memories, a crude but unmistakable representation of a music box, complete with a tiny dancing figure on top. How she could have known such a thing existed in his cabin was beyond his understanding, unless something in the accumulated silence of his home had whispered its secrets to her. Job lifted the music box from its cloth wrapping. his hands trembling slightly as he wound the small key. The first notes of the lullaby filled the cabin like ghosts, returning to familiar halls, each gentle tone carrying the weight of 1,000 bedtime stories and whispered prayers for sweet dreams. The effect on the girl was immediate and devastating. She looked up from her work, her storm-gray eyes widening with recognition and something deeper, a grief so profound it seemed to echo from the very depths of her soul. For a moment, she simply stared at the music box, watching the tiny dancer spin to the familiar melody. Then she began to cry, not the silent tears of someone trying to hide their pain, but the deep, wrenching sobs of a child who'd been holding back an ocean of sorrow behind walls that could no longer contain it. She doubled over as if physically struck, her small body shaking with the force of emotions too long suppressed. Job set the music box aside and moved toward her carefully, his heart breaking at the sound of such profound anguish. "Little one," he said softly, his voice barely audible above her weeping. She looked up at him through her tears, and for the first time since he'd found her, she made a sound that wasn't quite crying, a soft humming that matched the melody still playing from the music box. The tune was halting, broken by sobs, but unmistakably the same lullaby that had once soothed his own daughter to sleep. "Your mama used to sing this to you," Job said, understanding flooding through him like sunrise breaking over the mountains. The girl nodded frantically, her tears falling harder as she tried to hum along with the melody. It was the first real communication they'd shared, this wordless confession of loss that transcended the barriers her trauma had built. In that moment, Job saw her not as a mysterious refugee, but as a grieving child who'd lost everything that had ever made her feel safe. Without thinking about the wisdom of it, Job knelt beside her chair and opened his arms in invitation. She hesitated only briefly before throwing herself against his chest, her small hands clutching his shirt as she sobbed out months of suppressed grief and terror. He held her gently, one weathered hand stroking her dark hair, while he murmured the kind of meaningless comfort words that somehow carried infinite meaning. "I know," he whispered. "I know it hurts. I lost my little girl too, and her mama. Some pain doesn't ever go away completely, but it gets easier to carry if you don't try to carry it alone." Scout pressed close to them both, his warm bulk providing additional comfort as the girl gradually cried herself toward exhaustion. The music box wound down slowly, the lullaby fading to silence that felt different now, not empty, but full of shared understanding. When her sobs finally subsided to occasional hiccups, Job found himself talking to her about Rachel and Martha, sharing memories he'd kept locked away for 15 years. He told her about Rachel's favorite stories, about the way Martha would hum while she cooked, about the small rituals that had made their house a home. Rachel loved this music box, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She'd wind it up every night and listen to the whole song before she'd close her eyes. Said it kept the scary dreams away. The girl pulled back slightly to look at his face, her eyes red, but somehow clearer than they'd been since her arrival. She pointed to the music box, then to herself, then back to the box with a gesture that asked permission. "Of course," Job said, reaching for the delicate mechanism. "It should belong to someone who understands what it means." As he placed the music box in her small hands, Job felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of bonds he'd wrapped around his heart so tightly he'd forgotten they were there. For years, he'd believed that sharing his grief would somehow diminish his love for those he'd lost, that moving forward meant leaving them behind. But watching this wounded child cradle Martha's music box with the reverence it deserved, Job realized he'd been wrong about everything. Love wasn't something that could be hoarded or protected by isolation. Love was meant to be shared, passed on, used to heal new wounds, even as it honored old ones. The girl wound the music box carefully and listened to the lullaby with rapt attention, her lips moving silently, as if she was singing along with words only she could remember. When the melody finished, she looked at Job with an expression that held gratitude beyond her years. That night, As she settled down to sleep with the music box on the table beside her bed and the wooden cross clutched in her hand, Job heard her humming softly to herself. The sound was heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time, a child's attempt to recreate the comfort of a mother's voice through music and memory. For the first time in 15 years, Job knelt beside his own bed and offered a prayer that wasn't asking for forgiveness or understanding. Instead, he gave thanks for the child who'd brought music back into his home, for the opportunity to be useful again, for the reminder that even the most broken things could still provide comfort to others. Outside, the wind continued its eternal conversation with the mountain peaks, but inside the cabin, two grieving souls had found a moment of peace in shared sorrow and mutual understanding. The music box sat silent now, but its melody lingered in the air like a promise that beautiful things could survive even the darkest times. Scout lay stretched across the doorway, his ears alert despite his relaxed posture. Even in this moment of emotional breakthrough, the old dog remained vigilant, sensing threats that human hearts too full of hope might overlook. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers to face and decisions to make. But tonight, in a small cabin lost among the Colorado peaks, a broken man and a wounded child had found something worth protecting in each other, and that was enough to begin healing wounds that had seemed too deep for any balm to reach. The ride to Granite Falls took Job longer than usual, his mind occupied with thoughts of the girl he'd left sleeping safely in the cabin with Scout standing guard. Supplies were running low, and winter in the mountains demanded preparation that couldn't be delayed for sentiment. Still, every mile away from her felt like betrayal, even though he'd promised to return before. Nightfall. The town hadn't changed much in the months since his last visit. Still, the same collection of weathered buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud whenever it rained. The general store, saloon, and church formed the holy trinity of frontier civilization, while a scattering of houses and businesses filled in the gaps between necessity and hope. Job tied his horse outside Peterson's general store and made his way inside, nodding to the proprietor without initiating conversation. He'd learned over the years that the less he said, the fewer questions people asked about his hermit's existence in the mountains. Better to be thought unsociable than to invite the curiosity of well-meaning neighbors. Was examining a bolt of fabric, suitable for making the girl some proper clothes, when he saw it, a poster tacked to the wall beside the store's entrance, so new the ink hadn't yet begun to fade. The face staring back at him from that crude drawing made his blood run cold. It was her, unmistakably, undeniably her. The drawing captured those storm-grey eyes with startling accuracy, the serious expression she wore when concentrating on her artwork, even the way her dark hair fell across her forehead. But it was the words beneath the image that made Job's hands tremble as he read, "Wanted for questioning. $500 reward witness to murder contact, territorial marshal. Immediately considered dangerous, do not approach alone, $500. In a territory where most men earn $20 a month, that was a fortune large enough to make anyone forget their conscience. But it was the phrase witness to murder that hit Job like a physical blow, explaining so much about the girl's terror and the sophisticated pursuit she'd described in her drawings. Terrible business. "That," said Peterson from behind the counter, noticing Job's attention to the poster. "Little girl saw her whole family butchered by outlaws down near Cedar Creek. Only survivor, they say. Been missing for weeks now." Job forced his voice to remain steady. "What happened to the family?" "Homesteader's named Morrison. Had a claim near the creek. Been working it for 3 years or so. Good people from what I heard. Someone came in the night, killed them all. Parents, older son, even the grandparents who'd come for the winter. Burned the house down afterward, probably trying to hide the evidence." The storekeeper's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Word is, the Morrison place was sitting on something valuable. Silver maybe, or good water rights. But that's just talk, you understand. What's certain is that little girl was the only witness, and now every bounty hunter and lawman in 3 territories is looking for her. Bounty hunters." Job's voice cracked slightly on the words. "Oh yes. See, the territorial marshal put up that reward, but there's others offering money too. Some say the Morrison family had enemies who want to make sure that girl never testifies about what she saw. Dead witnesses can't point fingers, if you take my meaning. Job felt sick. The child sleeping in his cabin wasn't just running from corrupt lawmen. She was caught between two forces that wanted her for very different reasons. The authorities needed her testimony to solve a multiple murder, while the killers needed her dead to ensure their secret stayed buried. Anyone come through asking about her? Job asked, trying to sound casually curious rather than desperately concerned. Matter of fact, yes. 3 men rode through just yesterday, asking lots of questions. Didn't much like the look of them, truth be told. Claimed to be working for the territorial marshal, but something about them felt wrong. Too eager, if you know what I mean. Too interested in whether anyone had seen strangers in the area. Job's mind raced as he completed his purchases with hands that only slightly betrayed his anxiety. 3 men, just as the girl had drawn in her pictures. Professional hunters working for someone with enough money to offer competing rewards for her capture or death. The ride back to the cabin felt like the longest journey of his life. Every shadow could hide watchers. Every sound might herald the approach of men who saw a 10-year-old girl as nothing more than a loose end to be tied off. Job found himself constantly checking his back trail, using every trick he'd learned during his lawman days to ensure he wasn't being followed. The cabin appeared undisturbed when he finally arrived, but Scout's greeting was more agitated than usual. The old dog circled Job anxiously, whining low in his throat while casting worried glances toward the surrounding forest. Something had happened during his absence, something that had put the animal on edge. Inside, Job found the girl exactly where he'd left her, apparently asleep in the chair beside the fireplace. But her breathing was too shallow, too controlled, and her small hands were white-knuckled where they gripped the wooden cross. She was awake and terrified. "Little one," he said softly, approaching slowly so as not to startle her further. Her eyes snapped open, confirming his suspicions. "They were here," she whispered, the first words she'd spoken since her arrival at his cabin. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, barely audible above the crackling of the fire. Job's blood froze. "Who was here?" 3 men on horses. "They didn't see me, but I saw them." Her storm-grey eyes were wide with terror. One of them had something shiny on his chest, like what you showed me, a badge. Corrupt lawmen, just as he'd suspected, using their authority to hunt the very person they should have been protecting. Job knelt beside her chair, his mind already working through the implications of this development. "Did you recognize any of them?" The girl nodded slowly, her small hand reaching into her dress pocket to withdraw the torn photograph she always carried. For the first time, Job noticed that she was holding it differently, as if she'd discovered something new about the familiar image. "The man with the badge," she whispered. He had this. From her other pocket, she produced something that made Job's world tilt on its axis. The other half of the torn photograph, somehow acquired during the men's visit to his cabin. But this half showed more than just the missing portion of the original image. Around the neck of the man, standing beside the woman in the picture, was a distinctive silver locket, ornate and unmistakable. He dropped it when they were searching around the cabin, the girl explained, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It's my papa's locket. Mama gave it to him for their anniversary. He was wearing it the night they came." The full horror of the situation crashed over Job like an avalanche. The men hunting this child weren't just corrupt officials. One of them was the actual killer, wearing a badge while hunting the only witness to his crimes. The girl hadn't just seen her family murdered. She'd seen it done by someone sworn to uphold the law. "What's your name, little one?" Job asked gently, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Hope," she whispered, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "Hope Morrison. And that man with the badge, he's the one who killed my family. He shot Papa while he was begging for our lives. Then he put on Papa's locket, like it was some kind of trophy." Job gathered her into his arms as she began to sob, his own eyes burning with rage that threatened to consume his carefully maintained composure. A badge-wearing killer was hunting this brave little girl, probably with official sanction and unlimited resources. The very system that should have protected her was being used as a weapon against her. "He can't have you," Job whispered fiercely, his voice carrying the weight of an oath sworn on sacred ground. "I don't care what badge he wears or who sent him. He'll have to kill me first, and I don't plan on making that easy for him." Hope pulled back to look at his face, and what she saw there seemed to give her comfort. For the first time since speaking her name, she managed a tremulous smile. "I knew you'd protect me," she said quietly. "That's why I came here. Mama always said angels sometimes looked like regular people, and that they showed up when you needed them most." Outside, Scout's warning bark echoed through the mountain air, sharp and urgent. The sound sent both Job and Hope to the window, where they could see 3 riders approaching through the trees, moving with the confidence of men who believed they had their quarry cornered. The hunter had become the hunted, and the game was about to begin in earnest. The riders were still half a mile away, moving cautiously through the timber with the methodical precision of experienced hunters. Job counted 3 horses, just as Hope had described, their dark forms weaving between the snow-laden pines like shadows given substance. They'd found his trail from town and followed it home with the patience of men who were certain of their prey. "We have maybe 10 minutes before they reach the cabin," Job said quietly, his mind already shifting into the tactical thinking that had kept him alive during his lawman days. "Time enough to get you to safety, but not much more." Hope clutched the wooden cross tighter, her storm-grey eyes reflecting a courage that humbled him. "Where can we go?" Job pulled a hand-drawn map from beneath a loose floorboard, spreading it on the table with practiced efficiency. The parchment showed detailed trails through the mountains, marked with symbols that indicated water sources, shelter caves, and defensive positions he'd scouted during years of solitary wandering. "There's a cave system about 3 miles north of here," he explained, pointing to a cluster of marks on the map. "Natural fortress, good sight lines, multiple escape routes if we need them. More importantly, it's defensible by 1 man against superior numbers." "But what about Scout?" Hope asked, her voice catching on the old dog's name. Job looked at his faithful companion, who stood at the window with hackles raised and teeth bared in a silent snarl. Scout had been with him through 8 years of mountain winters, sharing his exile and providing the only companionship he'd allowed himself. The thought of leaving the old hound behind felt like tearing away a piece of his soul. "Scout stays with us," he decided, unable to abandon another member of his makeshift family. "He's gotten us out of trouble before, might do it again." They moved with urgent efficiency, packing only the essentials. Job filled his saddlebags with ammunition, dried food, and medical supplies, while Hope gathered her drawings and the precious items that connected her to happier times: the wooden cross, the music box, and the 2 halves of the photograph that had revealed her family's killer. "You'll need warmer clothes," Job said, pulling a heavy coat from his trunk. It had belonged to Rachel, carefully preserved in cedar shavings and mothballs. The coat was too large for Hope, but it would keep her alive in the mountain cold, as is her. Hope struggled into the oversized garment. Job made final preparations that spoke to his law enforcement background. He cached supplies in multiple locations around the cabin, creating potential resources they could return to retrieve if circumstances allowed. He set simple traps that would slow pursuit without causing permanent harm, tripwires that would spook horses, false trails that led to dead ends, obstacles that would force the hunters to dismount and proceed on foot. "Why are you helping me?" Hope asked suddenly, her question catching Job off guard. "You don't even know me." Job paused in his preparations, studying the brave little girl who'd brought purpose back into his empty life. How could he explain that? She'd given him something he'd thought lost forever, a reason to be the man he'd once been, a chance to stand between evil and innocence one more time. "Because someone needs to," he said simply. And because I failed to protect my own family when they needed me. Maybe this is God's way of giving me a second chance to do it right." Hope nodded, as if his answer made perfect sense. Though Job suspected she understood more about second chances than any child should. She'd been running for weeks, possibly months, surviving through wit and courage, while grown men with badges and guns hunted her like an animal. They slipped out the cabin's back door as the first rider emerged from the tree line, leading Job's horse on a circuitous route that avoided open ground. Scout padded silently beside them, his years of hunting making him invaluable for moving unseen through terrain that could betray the unwary with a single misstep. The journey to the cave system tested all of them. The snow was knee-deep in places, forcing Job to break trail, while Hope followed in his footsteps and Scout ranged ahead to scout for dangers. The cold was brutal, biting through even their heavy clothing with fangs that promised frostbite for anyone who stopped moving. But it was the emotional weight that proved most challenging. Hope struggled with memories triggered by their flight. The similarities to her family's final night when she'd hidden in the forest while killers burned her home. More than once, Job had to stop and comfort her through panic attacks that left her gasping and shaking. "They're not going to catch us," he promised during one such episode, his weathered hands gentle on her shoulders. "I know these mountains better than any man alive, and I'll use every advantage to keep you safe." "What if they find the cave?" Hope whispered, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. "Then we make them pay for finding it," Job replied grimly. His rifle was loaded and ready, and he carried enough ammunition to hold off a small army. The cave system he'd chosen offered excellent defensive positions, with narrow approaches that would force attackers to expose themselves while defenders remained protected. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Job found himself remembering of the times when he'd relied on terrain and tactics to overcome superior numbers. During his sheriff days, he'd once held off 6 bank robbers in a similar position, using patience and precise shooting to convince them that their target wasn't worth the cost of taking it. But this was different. Those bank robbers had been motivated by greed, willing to retreat when the odds turned against them. The men pursuing Hope were driven by desperation. If she lived to testify, at least one of them would hang. They wouldn't give up easily, and they'd fight with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. The cave entrance was hidden behind a screen of ice-covered brush, invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Job had discovered it during his second winter in the mountains, using it as emergency shelter during a blizzard that had nearly killed him. Since then, he'd gradually improved its defensive capabilities, stockpiling supplies and creating firing positions that commanded the approaches. "It's not much to look at from the outside," he admitted, as they squeezed through the narrow opening. "But it's home for the next few days." Inside, the cave opened into a surprisingly spacious chamber, warmed by thermal springs that kept the temperature comfortable even in the depths of winter. Job had constructed simple furniture from dead-fallen stones, creating a refuge that could sustain several people for weeks if necessary. Hope explored their temporary home with the curiosity of youth, examining the supplies Job had cached and testing the echoes that bounced off distant walls. Scout settled near the entrance, positioning himself where he could watch both the cave mouth and its human occupants. "Will they find us here?" Hope asked as Job began preparing defensive positions. "Eventually," Job admitted, checking the sights on his rifle. "But not tonight, and probably not tomorrow. These mountains can hide secrets for years if you know how to keep them." As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, Job posted himself at the cave entrance with a clear view of the trails below. Through his telescope, he could see lights moving in the valley, 3 separate sources that indicated the hunters had split up to cover more ground. They were professional, he'd give them that. But professionals could be predictable, and predictability was a weakness that could be exploited by someone who understood how predators thought. "Get some rest," he told Hope, though he had no intention of sleeping himself. "Tomorrow we start evening the odds." Hope curled up in the warm section of the cave, with Scout pressed against her for additional warmth, the old dog's presence providing comfort that no words could match. As she drifted towards sleep, Job heard her humming the lullaby from Martha's music box, the gentle melody echoing softly off the stone walls. Outside, the wind howled through the mountain peaks like the voices of ancient spirits, but inside there, hidden sanctuary, a broken man and a wounded child, prepared to face whatever dawn might bring. The hunters had the advantage of numbers and official sanction, but Job had something more valuable, absolute certainty about which side deserved to win. The game had begun in earnest, and Job Blackwood intended to remind these badge-wearing killers why the mountains were no place for men who preyed on the innocent. They came at dawn, moving through the grey half-light with the confidence of men who believed they'd cornered helpless prey. Job watched them through his telescope as they approached the cave system, 3 riders dismounting at the base of the trail and beginning their ascent on foot. Their leader wore a badge that caught the early morning light, and around his neck hung a silver locket that glinted with each step. Hope stirred behind him, awakened by Scout's low growl of warning. She moved to Job's side with the silent grace of someone who'd learned that survival often depended on making no sound at all. "Is that him?" Job asked quietly, handing her the telescope. Hope peered through the lens, her small hands trembling as she focused on the lead figure. When she saw the locket, her breath caught in a sharp gasp that told Job everything he needed to know. "That's Papa's locket," she whispered, her voice carrying a pain that no child should know. "That's the man who killed my family." Job felt something cold and implacable settle in his chest as he studied the approaching killers. The badge-wearer moved with military precision, flanked by 2 men who carried themselves like professional gunmen. They'd spread out as they climbed, maintaining communication through hand signals that spoke of extensive training. "Marshal Clayton Briggs," Hope said suddenly, recognition flooding her voice. "I heard him talking to Papa before he pulled his gun. Papa trusted him. Papa invited him into our house." The betrayal in her voice was heartbreaking, the realization that her family's killer had worn the very symbol that should have represented protection and justice. Job understood that betrayal intimately, having seen too many cases where badges became licenses for evil rather than shields for the innocent. "He's not getting that chance again," Job promised grimly, checking his rifle one final time. "Whatever happens, Hope, you stay in the back of the cave until I tell you it's safe. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens out here, you don't come forward until I call for you." Hope nodded solemnly, clutching the wooden cross in one hand and the torn photograph in the other. "Will you be okay?" Job managed a smile that held more confidence than he felt. "I've been in worse situations. These mountains don't forgive mistakes, and those men just made a big one by coming after something I'm protecting." The first shot came sooner than expected, a rifle bullet that sparked off the rocks near the cave entrance as the hunters tested the defensive position. Job didn't return fire immediately, instead using the telescope to study their positions and movements. Patience had always been his greatest weapon. Let the enemy reveal their tactics before committing to a response. Marshal Briggs had taken position behind a fallen log, about 200 yards down the slope, well within rifle range but protected from direct fire. His 2 companions had spread wider, trying to create crossfire angles that would force Job to expose himself no matter which direction he chose to engage. "Professional setup," Job murmured to himself, appreciating the tactical competence even as he planned to defeat it. "But they're thinking like lawmen, not mountain fighters." The second shot came from the left flank, followed immediately by a third from the right. They were trying to pin him down while Briggs advanced to a closer position. Standard law enforcement tactics for dealing with a barricaded suspect. But Job wasn't just any suspect. He was a man fighting for something more precious than his own life. Job's first shot took the leftmost gunman high in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering down the rocky slope. The man didn't die, but he was out of the fight. Clutching his wounded arm while seeking better cover, the return fire was immediate and intense. Multiple rifles sending lead ricocheting off the cave mouth in a deadly symphony. But Job had already moved to a secondary position, using the cave's natural angles to stay protected while maintaining fields of fire. Mountain 1, Valley 0, he called softly to Hope, using the scoring system he developed with Rachel during their hunting expeditions years ago. Hope's small voice replied from the depths of the cave, "Be careful." Job! It was the first time she'd used his name, and hearing it spoken with such trust and concern gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. This child had lost everything once. He would not let her lose it again. Marshal Briggs made his move during the next exchange, using his companion's covering fire to advance to a position only 50 yards from the cave entrance. But his approach took him across a section of loose shale that Job knew intimately, having nearly fallen to his death on those same rocks during his early years in the mountains. Job's shot was carefully placed, not at the man, but at the rocks beneath his feet. The bullet struck the shale with precisely the right force to trigger a small avalanche that sent Briggs tumbling toward a cluster of boulders below. When the dust settled, the corrupt marshal was alive but trapped, his leg pinned beneath a fallen stone and his rifle lost somewhere in the rockfall. Around his neck, Papa Morrison's silver locket caught the morning sun like a beacon of justice waiting to be reclaimed. The odds had suddenly become much more favorable, and Job Blackwood prepared to collect a debt that was 15 years overdue. The remaining gunman panicked when he saw his leader trapped, abandoning his cover to rush toward Briggs in a misguided rescue attempt. It was exactly the kind of emotional decision that got men killed in the mountains, where patience and calculation meant the difference between life and death. Job had been waiting for such a mistake. His father's rifle spoke with the authority of generations, the heavy 44-40 round taking the charging gunman center mass and dropping him into the snow 20 yards from where Briggs lay pinned. The man twitched once and lay still, his blood spreading in a crimson stain that would freeze solid before the sun reached its zenith. "Behind you!" Hope's voice cut through the gunfire like a blade, sharp and urgent and filled with desperate warning. Job spun to see the wounded gunman from the left flank limping toward the cave entrance, his good arm leveling a pistol with deadly intent. The shot that followed seemed to echo forever in the mountain air, but it wasn't Job's rifle that spoke. Scout had launched himself at the wounded man with the fury of a wolf protecting his pack. 60 pounds of loyal hound colliding with the gunman's chest and sending them both tumbling down the rocky slope. When they came to rest against a snow-covered boulder, only Scout was moving, though blood matted his grizzled fur where the dying man's knife had found its mark. The old dog limped back toward the cave, his amber eyes bright with pain, but his tail wagging weakly to show he was still in the fight. "Good boy," Job called softly, his heart swelling with pride and concern. "That's my good boy." Marshal Briggs was struggling to free himself from the rocks when Job approached, the corrupt lawman's face twisted with pain and rage. The silver locket around his neck swayed with each futile movement, catching the light like evidence waiting to be claimed. "You're making a mistake, mountain man," Briggs snarled through gritted teeth. "I'm a territorial marshal. You kill me, and every lawman in Colorado will hunt you down." Job stopped just outside the trapped man's reach, his rifle trained steadily on Briggs's chest. "The way you hunted down a 10-year-old girl. The way you murdered her family in cold blood." Briggs's eyes widened with surprise, then narrowed with calculating malice. "So the little bitch did make it this far. Smart girl, I'll give her that. Smarter than her father, anyway. Stupid fool believed every word I told him about protecting his family from claim jumpers." The casual cruelty in Briggs's voice made Job's finger tighten on the trigger, but he forced himself to remain controlled. This man needed to confess, needed to provide the evidence that would clear Hope's name and ensure justice for the Morrison family. "Why?" Job asked simply. Briggs laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the surrounding rocks. "Silver, mountain man. More silver than you could spend in 3 lifetimes, just sitting there under Morrison's worthless homestead. All I had to do was convince him to sell to my associates, take a reasonable finder's fee, and everyone would have been happy, but he wouldn't sell. Stubborn fool, had some romantic notion about leaving land to his children. Couldn't see that dead men don't pass on inheritances. Briggs struggled again against the pinning rocks, his movements growing weaker. So we made it look like a claim jumper raid, burned the evidence, and planned to file our own claim once the territorial office declared the Morrison family dead. Except Hope survived. Little mistake that's been causing me considerable inconvenience, Briggs admitted, but nothing that can't be corrected once I deal with you. Job heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Hope emerging from the cave, moving with careful determination despite his earlier instructions to stay hidden. Scout limped beside her, the old dog's protective instincts overriding his injuries. Hope, "Go back inside," Job ordered gently, but Hope shook her head, her storm-grey eyes fixed on the trapped marshal with an intensity that seemed to burn. "I need to see him. I need to remember his face so I can tell everyone what he did to my family." Briggs saw her then, and his expression shifted from pain to predatory hunger. "There's my little witness. Come closer, girl. Let me see how much you've grown." Hope took a step forward, and for a heart-stopping moment, Job thought she was going to walk within reach of the trapped killer. Then she spoke, her voice carrying across the mountain air with crystalline clarity. "My name is Hope Morrison. My papa was Benjamin Morrison, and my mama was Sarah Morrison. This man killed them both while they begged for mercy. He killed my brother Tommy and my grandparents too. Then he stole Papa's locket and wore it like a trophy. Her testimony rang against the stone peaks like a bell-tolling judgment, each word carefully enunciated for maximum impact. Job realized she was creating an official record, speaking for any hidden listeners who might carry her words back to legitimate authorities. "I saw everything," she continued, her young voice growing stronger with each syllable. "I saw Marshal Clayton Briggs murder my family for silver he thought was under our land. I saw him burn our house to hide the evidence. And I saw him take Papa's locket from his dead body." Briggs lunged upward with desperate strength, his hand closing around a loose rock that he hurled at Hope with murderous intent. But Job's rifle was already moving, the heavy bullet taking the corrupt marshal in the chest and slamming him back against the stones with final authority. The silver locket fell free as Briggs died, spinning through the air to land at Hope's feet like justice finally delivered. She picked it up with reverent care, cradling the precious memento against her heart. "It's over," Job said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of promises kept and wrongs finally made right. Hope looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. But for the first time since he'd found her, they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. "Thank you," she whispered, the 2 words carrying more gratitude than any speech could have conveyed. Spring came early that year, painting the mountain meadows with wildflowers that seemed to celebrate the return of hope to a place that had known too much sorrow. Job and Hope had spent the winter months in careful preparation, not just for the changing seasons, but for the new life they were, building together in the wake of violence and loss. The territorial authorities had been surprisingly understanding when Job finally made contact with legitimate law enforcement, bringing Hope down from the mountains to tell her story to officials who actually cared about justice. Marshal Briggs's corruption had been deeper than anyone suspected, involving multiple murders and a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Hope's testimony became the cornerstone of a prosecution that cleaned house from Colorado Springs to Denver. The legal adoption papers had been finalized in late February, making official what had already become true in their hearts. Hope Morrison became Hope Blackwood, though she chose to keep her family's name as her middle names, Hope Morrison Blackwood, honoring both the family she'd lost and the man who'd saved her. They'd built a new cabin together, farther up the mountain and closer to the cave system that had provided sanctuary during their darkest hours. This one was larger, with a proper bedroom for Hope and windows positioned to catch the morning sun. Job had carved the window frames himself, incorporating small decorations that Hope designed, flowers and birds and symbols of the new life they were creating together. Scout had recovered from his injuries, though he moved more slowly now and required extra warmth during cold nights. The old dog had appointed himself Hope's personal guardian, following her everywhere and sleeping beside her bed with the devotion of a knight protecting royalty. His courage during the final battle had earned him hero status in their small family, with the best portions of every meal and unlimited access to the warmest spots by the fire. Hope had blossomed in ways that amazed Job daily. Her silence had given way to curiosity and laughter. Her drawings had evolved from desperate communications into joyful artistic expression, and her nightmares had gradually been replaced by dreams of the future they were building together. She'd insisted on learning to read, attacking the project with the same determination she'd once applied to survival. And Job found himself remembering the joy of teaching as he guided her through her first books. The music box held a place of honor on the mantelpiece, its gentle melody filling their evenings with the kind of peace that could only come from shared love and mutual protection. Hope had learned to wind it herself, treating the delicate mechanism with the reverence due to something precious and irreplaceable. Job had purchased a new Bible during their spring trip to Granite Falls, the old one having remained unopened for so many years that it felt like someone else's book. This new one was intended for family devotions, for teaching Hope the stories and values that had once guided his own life before grief had led him astray. "Tell me about Mama and Papa again," Hope said one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and purple. It had become their favorite ritual. These evening conversations where Job shared memories of Martha and Rachel, while Hope spoke about her parents and brother, weaving their separate histories into a tapestry of love that honored all those they'd lost. "Your papa sounds like he was a lot like my papa," Hope observed after Job finished telling her about Benjamin Morrison's determination to build something lasting for his family. "Both of them wanted to leave the world better than they found it. I think they would have been friends," Job agreed, his arm tightening around her shoulders as she nestled against his side. "Good men recognize each other, no matter where they come from." Scout lifted his grizzled head from where he lay, sprawled across their feet, his amber eyes reflecting the dying light as he checked for any threats to his beloved family. Finding none, he settled back into his comfortable position, a living reminder that love and loyalty could overcome any obstacle. "Job?" Hope's voice carried a question that seemed to hold special significance. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Mama and Papa know I'm okay now? Do you think they know I found you?" Job considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, looking out over the vast wilderness that had sheltered them both in their times of greatest need. "I think they know," he said finally. "I think they guided you to my door that night because they knew I needed you as much as you needed me." Hope was quiet for a long moment, digesting this thought. "So we saved each other?" "We saved each other," Job confirmed, his voice thick with emotion that still surprised him sometimes. For so many years, he'd believed himself incapable of love, convinced that his failure to protect his own family had disqualified him from caring for anyone else. But Hope had proven him wrong about everything. Love wasn't something that could be exhausted or used up. It was something that grew stronger with sharing, something that honored the past while embracing the future. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Job found himself offering a prayer of gratitude for the mysterious ways that healing could arrive in a person's life. He'd lost everything once, but that loss had prepared him to recognize and cherish the second chance that came disguised as a child's cry in a winter storm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to learn and grow and build something beautiful together. But tonight, as Hope's breathing deepened into the peaceful rhythm of secure sleep and Scout's gentle snores provided a comforting counterpoint, Job Blackwood knew that he was exactly where he belonged. In the end, it wasn't about the family he'd failed to save. It was about the family he'd been given the chance to protect. And this time, with God's grace and a little girl's courage to guide him, he wouldn't fail. The mountains whispered their ancient secrets to the wind. But inside the warm cabin, two healed hearts had found their way home to each other at last.